So before the break, we looked at three theories of truth put forward by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and we recognized the difference between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in terms of Plato and Socrates saying it's the ideals that come from the gods, and it's the perfect world that the gods intend for us, both in the origin of creating this world that we live in and in the teleos goal that the gods have for the world that we live in. Whereas Aristotle said, as people who work with scientia, science we call it in these days, are looking for true knowledge which can be verified by evidence, and as teachers we may use tests as ways of gathering that evidence. But we face a challenge in each of these theories, Plato and Aristotle, and the challenge is the one of correspondence. That is, our beliefs and our language must align with the truth themselves, and often a truth like intelligence cannot be fully understood or known. However, over time, we believe that we can get closer to the truth, and with each scholarly discipline, whether it be mathematics or astronomy or geology, we believe that there are truths that we can get closer to, and then we live in communities. And if this community is a scholarly community, and if there is a school of astronomers or a school of geologists within that school or community, we may be able to test one another to see whether we are closer to the truth or not. And we call this peer review. And so in peer review, we are accountable. And so since ancient times, Socrates and Plato, through to our own time, there are these schools where people gather. Christians, of course, may establish schools because we see our goals as being slightly different to secular institutions, and we may include character and prayer and worship as part of what we believe is part of truth. And then Plato expands the correspondence model into the tripartite model of finding truth, in which he adds the third component, which is evidence, justification, and in teaching, we need some way of justifying our evidence. And we could do this through exams or essays. We could also do it through observation, but we have to remember that we work in a political environment. So in order to survive, you've got to keep parents happy, you've got to keep the board happy, you've got to keep the headmaster happy. So there's a lot going on as well, outside of simply establishing what is true. Of course, Socrates believed that the great way to find truth is through questions, and the Socratic method uses questions in the classroom. Can anyone tell me what happened to Socrates? What was the outcome of Socrates getting everyone to question everything? Reuben?
He was put on trial, and he could have posted, he could have gotten out of it and gone into exile to Athens, wasn't it?
Yes.
But he instead decided that he wanted to stay and be a sacrifice for truth, or something like that.
Exactly. So he decided to stay and hold to what was truth. And by staying and holding to what was truth, he then ended up being given the option, you've got to make a decision in regards to these truths in terms of are you going to change? Because one of the real problems was that politicians often say things that they don't want to be questioned. And so Socrates, by raising questioning, was challenging the government of his time. And they said, Socrates, are you going to give in and accept? You shouldn't be asking questions. And Socrates took the poison instead and lost his life. And so that's called the Socratic method, whereby we ask questions. And so in terms of asking questions, this raises the thought as to inside your classroom, what's the benefits and difficulties in asking questions? So Socrates lived 469 to 399 BC in Athens, and he developed the Socratic method of questioning, which keeps asking questions. And have you noticed sometimes that students and children can become annoying when they keep asking questions? But Socrates said it's important to ask questions. And rather than just giving a lecture with content to your students, it's really good if you can get the students to ask questions. So the Socratic method involves asking questions. And can I get a couple of people to tell me what's the benefits of the question method of, instead of just delivering the material, you start with questions, move on to more questions, and then ask even more questions, the Socratic method. So who can tell me, someone, what's the benefits of this?
Is it kind of like if you know that you're going to be like asked a question, or if you've already been asked a question about your opinion or your view on a topic, like it engages you and it makes you sort of well, you're aware that you're going to be questioned, so you're more engaged in the topic and you want to have input. Absolutely. So it engages the student and makes them more aware. Someone else?
It feels like their independence too. Like you're not thinking for them. They're actually, like, you're helping them to create their own identity and their own thinking and their own beliefs and understandings, rather than just telling them.
I like that developmental idea, Natalie, that they are growing and developing in their thinking skills rather than just in their feeding skills of gathering information. So I really like that. Yeah. So the Socratic method questioned and re-examined people, but it went further than just asking questions about the content. It also included questions about your life, what is good, and questions about formation, what is virtue, questions about what was worth living for. And Plato said the unexamined life is not worth living. He encouraged examination of every aspect of life, and he paid a price for that. Socrates used questions to approach the people instead of providing them with answers. So we've seen a couple of the benefits. Who can tell me what's some of the problems with this focus on questions? So you've got a class, and in your class, what's some of the dangers or weaknesses of beginning with questions, and then 3 hours later they're still asking questions and you're encouraging questions? What's the weakness of this questioning approach?
Well, of course, sometimes as humans, we tend to come to a conclusion in our minds, and we can continue on in it for a long time. But without a person who's bouncing those questions back at us and questioning our questions, I've found that, you can kind of get on the wrong track. But then also on the other side of that, if you're asking too many questions and answering too many questions, it can tend to go on for a long time and you don't really get anywhere at all.
That's right. So you've got a circular track where it just goes round in a circle. You've got off track, interesting, but it doesn't get the curriculum covered, the material covered. And then depending on which group you're in, so if it's an anti-COVID, anti-vax group, then the questions will bring out the other viewpoints of the group that you're a part of. So there's an element of group think in that approach as well. So certainly the Socratic method, the questioning method, has a lot of benefits, but it also has some difficulties. If you go to the New South Wales website for the Department of Education, you'll see that they have quite a bit to say about the benefits of questioning, and they quote Hattie, Cotton, Walsh and Satis as saying that questioning accounts often for a third of all teaching time. We might give half of our time to explanation, but often the students are asking questions, and often it's the questions that help us to understand where they're at, to understand the difficulties that they're facing. So questions are very, very important for feedback to the teacher. At the same time, questions can be a difficulty if they get us off the track. You have to be careful on how to handle humour. And so you've got to have some guidelines if one student just wants to be very silly all the time. So you've got to decide how you're going to handle that. Teachers can ask even a couple of questions every minute, hundreds in a day, thousands in a year. It's an important part of what we do, and therefore we can develop skills in answering questions. So that's the Education New South Wales website, professional learning on questioning. Who's got some ideas on what sort of questions are good questions, and the questions you begin with may be different to the questions you move on to later on? Some thoughts on what's some good types of questions to ask?
Definitely open questions.
Yeah.
If you're just asking closed questions, it tends to be a guess, and if you get it right, well, good job, it was a 50% chance, but you're not really thinking critically into it. So open questions with long answers, probably not too long, but long enough answers.
Yeah, excellent. Other thoughts on what sort of questions and what are good questions?
Just questions of like, if you're talking about a particular topic, like what have you already established?
Yes.
Like children already understand, or I should say students. Like if you're introducing a topic, does anyone have any idea of what it would look like? Those kind of questions. And also with like behavior modification, open-ended questions are good, but when it comes to behavior or something, you kind of need to be really specific as well. Like, do you want to go sit by yourself for 10 minutes, or do you want to go for a walk around the block and come back when you're like had a breather? And it's like, they're really important questions to ask too, like giving them the choice, but also putting the boundary in.
And one way to get all the students involved is the pair share method. So you might get students to ask a question of the other student next to them in pairs. Another method is at the end of a session or the day, all students could write down the question that they have. And so that would get all students involved, because there's a danger if you've got 30 students and only one student is asking the question and speaking, are you leaving the others out? And so there are ways to get students more involved with all of the different ways the questions can be addressed and asked. So certainly Socrates used the question and answer method, and then Plato adopted that method, and Aristotle then got the students to focus on the evidence. Let's not just talk about the ideals, let's focus on the evidence. One of the interesting developments in history, and history often has accidental turns and twists to it, is that from the time of the Church Fathers, 300 or 400 AD, through to 1100 AD, Aristotle fell out of favour and people started to focus on Plato's notion of the ideals. However, around 1100 AD, when they were establishing universities at Oxford, Cambridge, and over in northern Italy and Spain and in Paris, where Thomas Aquinas was teaching, with the Crusades going down to Jerusalem to reconquer the land, but also with the Arabs moving up into Spain. One of the things that had happened through history is that the Muslims had kept in the Arab world the writings of Aristotle, whereas the Christian nations in France and Italy and through Europe had focused on the writings of Plato. And when Aristotle's writings were discovered, there was this big question then as to whether they should be taught in the universities. And people like Thomas Aquinas took the writings of Aristotle into the University of Paris, and there was a big discussion about whether this would be a good thing or a not so good thing. But from the 1100 AD and Thomas Aquinas, we have an emphasis on Aristotle's way of thinking alongside Plato's way of thinking. So it's fascinating change and history. And then up to the modern time, I think there's from 1700, 1800 through to the modern time, I think there's been a focus on Aristotle's way of thinking, focused on the present, focused on the material, focused on evidence, and there's been less emphasis on character, less emphasis on ideals, less emphasis on the gods. Anyone got any thoughts on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, the modern world? And in assignment 2, you might want to write a bit about the modern world and its individualistic focus there. Any thoughts on this development from 1100, rediscovery of Aristotle, emphasis on evidence? It's brought a lot of benefits in medicine. However, hospitals have changed from places of hospitality for the homeless and everyone who's suffering to places where we work on evidence-based drugs and treatments. So there's been a change there. Some thoughts on the modern world. The Aristotelian world of evidence and the present and the material, as opposed to the Platonic world. Yeah. Josiah, any thoughts?
I wouldn't say it's inherently a negative or a positive. I think it really, as with most things, needs to exist within a balance. And say different areas of our society emphasize Aristotle's worldview and different areas emphasize Plato's. So, for example, probably current kind of self-truth and be your best self is very Plato, and that's a very current modern ideology. But then if you look into things like law and medicine, it's very Aristotle oriented. So I'd say, yeah, it's not as black and white as people see.
Yeah, and I think that's excellent. That really shows the complexity of the situation. Now, going back to Plato, of course, your exercise that you did had to do with the cave analogy. Stephanie, do you want to briefly tell us how did you find the cave analogy from Plato, where you're looking like Aristotle at what seems to be real, which is test results, but at the same time, Plato is saying the really interesting things are the ideals, the unseen. You got to turn 180 degrees, like Jesus says, with repentance and from a religious perspective, and walk towards the light, which is further down around the corner, which is where real truth is. It's eternal and it's ideal. Thoughts, Stephanie, on the cave analogy? How did that speak to you and your forum post?
Yeah, it's the first time that I've seen this analogy when I was doing the forum post, and I did find it really interesting. I think part of it from a teaching perspective, where you can't force someone to want to learn, they have to kind of take those steps themselves, was quite interesting to me. It kind of reminded me of like the saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink kind of thing. And I think that's true in a religious capacity as well. It's not until you have like your own revelation that you can like start your faith journey. So I think you can have all the information, but yeah, I think there's definitely a decision process in that.
Yeah. And I like that idea, is that you can't force education on students, but you've got to encourage them to be open to the revelation, to move towards the light. And you could link this up with theories of development. And so you could have Erik Erikson's theory of development, where there are stages that you go through. Hands up those who've come across Erik Erikson and theories of development. A lot of people really love that. And you can Google these stages there. Interestingly, Erik Erikson's stages are linked to vices and virtues in particular. And a number of people have questioned whether you can really link psychology to a study of virtues, as Erikson does. James Fowler looks at faith. And so we looked before at correspondence theory. You've got a truth, and then you've got belief, and this can include Christian belief, and then you've got evidence. And James Fowler talks about stages of faith, and not only in religion, but also in everything that we believe in. There can be 6 or so stages that we go through as we move from looking at the obvious things that seem before us when we're a 6-year-old, to turning around and realizing as a 12-year-old the world is more complex and I've got to think more deeply about it. And then as a 24-year-old, the world's even more complex. And then as a 34-year-old, realize that there's all these different viewpoints, and a lot of what seems to be around in the world is actually unseen, which aligns a bit with what Plato is saying. So these stages of faith development align a little bit with Plato's cave idea. And so we could think a bit further there. So in Perry's scheme of knowing, people move from a dualism. There's right and wrong. It's not denial. It's just I'm selective about the reality I accept, through to multiplicity, to relativism, and then finally on to developing a commitment into truth, says Perry in his model. So there's transitions from just right and wrong through to complexity in decision making. A good, a true or false test at last, some clarity. Every sentence is either sweet true or sweet false, one or the other, nothing in between. So I'll flip a coin on every one and then I'll find out what's correct. So that's Calvin and Hobbes' answer to working out what is true. So James Fowler has written about the faith response, which not only relates to what we know, but it also relates there to what we accept as true. Getting back to Aristotle's looking at evidence approach, there's a fascinating looking at evidence approach that has been used in all sorts of areas, including education, and it's called grounded theory. Can I get people to put up their hand if they have come across grounded theory? Well, let me introduce grounded theory. Yes. Can you tell me a little bit, is it Natalie or someone who's got some thoughts on grounded theory?
Yeah, I know about it. I've been taught about it,
Yeah.
but no, I can't. I really can't.
We're moving gradually towards the truth through a series of stages there. So grounded theory is the idea that instead of starting with an idea, an ideal, such as where we want the students to go to, what our goals are, such as goals in education, and then we have a hypothesis, that if we teach a certain way, and if we have a test, it'll measure it. So we have these hypotheses, and then we move along and we gather some evidence to see if it's true. In grounded theory, you work from the bottom up instead. So you have no preconceptions to send you in the wrong direction. So there's no preconceptions. Instead, you simply observe. So you observe what's going on, and then you write down what's going on. So you go into the classroom, you don't test initially, you put tests off as long as you can, you observe what's happening, but you do take lots of records from your observations. So grounded theory was developed by Glasser and Strauss, and it's based on a theory of pragmatism. It looks at what is working and works from that, rather than from ideas and ideals like Plato works from. And so it's a reaction against grand ideas and ideals, and it works from the evidence forward without having any preconceptions. And in many ways, it's not a linear process, it's circular. It looks at observations, comes up with ideas, goes back and looks at observations. In one of the most radical thoughts on grounded theory, so if you're writing essay number 2 for Dr. Sam Hay, you might do no pre-reading. You just look at the students, look in the mirror, look at yourself, right? So no references at the end of your essay. And then you could have some very original insights because you're not being pre-guided by anything you are doing. So this is Glasser's grounded theory approach. So what do you think of grounded theory as approach? What's the strengths and limitations of grounded theory? So we're not doing these tests. We're not asking last year's teachers how the student was doing. We're going in with a purely blank piece of paper and observing the students as they are and writing down what we observe, and then we're thinking more deeply about things. What are your thoughts on grounded theory?
I really personally like it. From what I only just really learned about it just then from what you were saying. But
Yeah.
so far what I've heard is that it's very, let's get what we can right now and let's not prepare, which is both ways are good in different situations, but I guess it depends on what you're looking for from the students. But personally, if I was to enter into a classroom, I would like to go in not having any conceptions of what I should be expecting and just take exactly what it is. Although preparing is good because it'll help you to identify what you need to find, what you need to look for. So I think both of them have great benefit, both sides, preparing or not preparing. Both of them, that's what I was going to say.
And I did a study in biblical studies and then moved on to look at mega churches, the big churches in Australia. And I tried some grounded theory where I would go out and interview 100 and something different leaders in churches. And so you could Google Sam Hay mega churches and see what I've done there. And I tried grounded theory, but at the same time, as a scholar, it's a lot easier to read what other scholars are saying in America and England, and then interact with other scholars there as well. So I tried both, and I think in many ways both is a way that you tend to come to. Someone else with their thoughts on grounded theory, the strengths, the limitations, or both, Madeline?
Well, limitations wise in the classroom, if you're going to do, let's say you get a handover report from your year 3 teacher because you're a year 4 teacher, straight you can assess the kid without those preconceived ideas, especially if they're behavior ideas. You don't think that the kid's going to be a disruptive or naughty kid. You're just taking them on face value of how they're in your classroom. But the time it might take you to do your testing to sort them into the adequate literacy group and get them adequate literacy support or numeracy support, you're kind of not wasting time, but you lost the opportunity to take the information and the testing from before to give the kid immediate support for what they might need.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for that reason, a combination of both is often useful. You try and have a bit of a blank slate, but at the same time, you do go and ask the students, because ask last year's teachers, because it can speed up the process. If you discover someone's got poor eyesight, another one's got poor hearing, that can save you a lot of observation and things that you could miss. So the advantage of grounded theory is that it avoids preconceived ideas. The disadvantage is that it takes a long time to work out. This could either be qualitative or quantitative. So in quantitative, you try and write down specific things there. A number of times people do this or that. Qualitative, you write on about what you observe. Often you might use coding. So hands up anyone who's used coding with information that you gather. So if you write down what the parent said or what the student says or what the student does, you then look for patterns in the notes that you take. You look for key words as themes, and then you look to develop this idea as well. On the other side, beyond grounded theory, being well read allows you to observe better. To observe without any contextual ideas can weaken your understanding of the concepts that you're working with. So it helps there. So I think the answer is that a healthy combination of grounded theory together with reading is also very, very useful as well. Some people have observed that perceptions, what you see, isn't always correct. And so we can show some examples of that. The five senses tell us what's immediately before us, but sometimes having a hunch or intuition can be more effective than the five senses. Can anyone tell me, why does a pilot of an aeroplane landing a plane or taking off sometimes not just rely on their five senses, but relies on their instinct and their intuition as well? So you're flying an aeroplane. Any thoughts on why you might rely? Josiah, any thoughts on pilot of an aeroplane? You're not just using sight and looking at all the instruments, you're relying on intuition, landing an aeroplane, etc. Why is intuition useful?
I believe we talked about this last week, and I think Ruben gave an answer, so that's not right. But it was basically that they've done the theory that much that it's become subconscious, and they don't have time to consciously observe and check every single dial and blinking light. So they have to rely on their subconscious, trust their subconscious knowledge regarding landing and weather conditions and all that, and just play it by ear, basically.
Yeah, and next week we'll look a bit of this in association with Christianity. That is, there are things that you can work through about your faith, but there are things that you take a faith leap on, such as your trust in God, that comes more from inner senses rather than outward logic. So next week we'll have a look at that a little bit in relation to Christianity. An exercise on perception here. So there's a truth, the number of circles, and then there is a observation of the truth. That is, we're gathering information here, and then we could write down the observation of the truth. Can I get everyone to write down how many circles there are? And I think in the end, we're going to find that there are possibly multiple truths here. And it's in the language that we're using. So the very word circles, can you see the way our eyes work and our minds work leads to multiple statements? Hands up those who can see 8 circles. So that's one possible answer. And to do that, you have to fill in the top and bottom of the circles, but also hands up anyone who sees no circles. because it's possible to say that we actually haven't drawn in any circles. It's our eyes that are constructing the circles. So no circles would be another possible answer. Hands up anyone who says 6 circles. So 6 circles would be a possible answer if these are half circles and the bottom ones are half circles. So I think there's more going on here. There's multiple answers. Josie, what's your thoughts?
I was saying that could we also count like the letters in the words?
Yeah, that's possible. And this, in a few weeks' time, we'll look at language and how language is part of the way we work with truth and statements about truth and whether something's true or not. What about this here? What can you see here?
Letter E.
Yeah, so letter E. And yet it's not the letter E. It's our mind and our eyes are creating the letter E. And so truths can be shaped by, think about the people around you that can guide your understanding of truth, because it could be the community you live in. And next week, when we look at Christian views of truth, we might say that the particular perspective we have on our Christian belief could come from one group for another. For instance, I'm a personal relationship with God and Jesus person because that's what I've been brought up with. But I've gone and met with other Christians who are impersonal. God made the world and it just unfolds. And so in a class that I teach, I could have personal relationship with God people and students. And so I encourage them to pray and to believe. And yet I could have other students who come from a different tradition. And so we've got to be aware of these different traditions and backgrounds that we have. So today, we have looked at the following goals, and then I'll get you to write down what stood out to you. We started off by talking at the beginning of the first session how much time to spend, how to focus your time. And we said that out of 10 hours a week for each subject, 4 subjects, 40 hours a week, you got about 5 hours, a couple of hours in the classroom, and then another 2, 3, 4 hours before and after. And then you've got around 5 hours a week on the assignments for each subject. Then we went through to 3 models of truth. There is the correspondence, which says even though there's a truth out there, we've got to make a commitment to that truth. We've got to put it into words and language. We've got to communicate it to one another. And then in Plato's tripartite theory of knowledge, we've then got evidence and justification. Another theory of truth, which we haven't said a lot about, is coherence. And that is within a particular subject area, there's coherence. So maths, 2 + 2 = 4, 3 + 3 = 6. All of these different topics cohere because they were in the one system of thought. If you're a particular Christian denomination, it'll all make sense within that particular approach. If you're a Platonist, it'll make sense to Platonists. If you're an Aristotelian, it'll make sense to Aristotelians. Or if you're a combination of both, it will make sense there. We've not said a lot about the danger of relativism, but we have said a bit about individualism. Fundamentalism, we'll talk about more about next week, where people get into a small group and say, these are the fundamentals that we believe in, but they cut themselves off from others. Others are skeptical, they doubt everything, agnostic, they question everything, or atheistic. They don't believe anything except what they believe. We spent some time on the Socratic method, and in your forum, we looked at Plato's cave. And then in the second session, we went on and looked at Aristotle and evidence and scientia, true knowledge. And we also looked at inductive grounded theory, such as similar to what Aristotle uses. Can we go around now and see what are some thoughts on things that stood out to each one? Reuben, what stood out to you today? Reuben?
For me, the discussion with Plato and Socrates, just with empiricism versus idealism, how I can apply a healthy balance between them, be conscious that I am.
Yeah. So certainly
balance between them, as opposed to just leaning to my natural tendency.
Yeah, that's good. Josiah, what stood out to you?
I'd say probably what stood out most to me is the fact that these three weird old guys' ideas and beliefs from thousands of years ago managed to be so ingrained in modern society and culture. And I found that quite fascinating.
Yeah, and it is amazing the influence they have, because I think they identify a very valid way of understanding truth. So we've got the truth, and then we've got to try and describe it. We use language, and certainly Augustine and others work with this concept. We then need evidence, and so what they identified in ancient Greece is still with us today, 2,000 years later. That reminds us of the importance of culture. So we're part of a Western culture. There's also understandings of truth from Asian cultures as well. And so culture can be very, very important there. Josie, what stood out to you?
So for me, I was sort of thinking about the idea that truth is perceived differently to people, and it's more than just right or wrong. And you were just saying about culture. I think worldview and culture is definitely a big influence of how people perceive the truth.
And certainly in assignment 2, that gives you a chance to think about culture and to think about these two grand concepts of idealism and pragmatism and evidentialism, or measuring what's taking place. And so we're looking at the evidence that we have before us that we can see, which is empiricism. And so all of these flow into our Western culture, and there's been a bit of a move away from the ideals and idealism towards empiricism in our modern world, and towards individualism. It's part of the change that's occurring. And in assignment 2, you could possibly include something there. Stephanie, what stood out to you today?
Probably looking at the Socratic method of asking questions, and just how that can be both effective and ineffective in either reinforcing objectives or reinforcing bias, just depending on how you use it. So I think that's a good applicable skill to have.
And certainly Socrates introduces the idea of replying to a question with a question. And so you're talking about something, why do you think this happens? And the student says, I think such and such, what do you think this? And then you say, yeah, before we move on to my answers as a teacher, I'd like to ask another question. Now there's a danger in that people can feel shy, embarrassed, and so you've got to have some supportive approach. Socrates could get quite aggressive and say, look, you've said that, but do you have enough evidence? And if you're going to take that strong Socratic approach, then you've got to develop strong students in a very safe environment for them to be able to respond to that strong Socratic questioning approach as well. They need a lot of support for that. Gabrielle, thoughts on what stood out today?
Yeah, I think just like the same thing as with Ruben talking about idealism versus.
Yeah.
Sorry, I keep going.
That sounds good. And Shyla, thoughts?
Yeah, I'd never heard of like empiricism and stuff before. Like I'm kind of the concepts of like what they mean, but I didn't know, like I'd never heard those words. So it was kind of interesting that there's sort of a whole lot of thought behind those.
Yeah, and if you've got time, you could make a note of some of these, and you can watch the video after today and just make a note. And we suggest 1 or 2 hours follow up, whereby make a note of a couple of key ideas like idealism, empiricism. And then if you said in education and you Googled in education, you give some thought as to the advantage and disadvantage of both. And so empiricism, we've said you've got to do some tests. You've got to describe things as they are. You've got to keep a diary. as to this student did that, that student did that. But at the same time, Plato's idealism, to see the unseen possibilities, that every student could be brilliant and every student could do great things, because that could be the intention of the gods. That's really quite important as well. Madeline, your thoughts?
For me, what stood out was correspondence theory. The idea that how we talk about truth and the discourse of truth, the language that we have available to us, which would be shaped by our culture, can then be like in contrast with what truth is. So you can only talk about truth in the language that you have, which might put it in contradiction to the truth. I think that's really interesting.
That's great. Natalie?
I just found it really fascinating because I'm already in early childhood, and obviously I'm studying to be an early childhood teacher. So like Aristotle and the grounded theory, and like how actually embedded that is in the whole framework and foundation of early childhood. But I also found it fascinating, like Plato's response to that, like because early childhood is all about observing the child and the evidence and the testing and the like basis, like that's the cycle. So then it was interesting having Plato be the kind of opposite, kind of similar, to be like, yeah, like every child is unique, every child is perfectly designed by God's purpose, but yeah, it's also kind of like just steer away from that observation.
Now we're going to run out of time here, but can I ask if anyone's got any questions now? We could go on 5 minutes past the end if you've got questions. Otherwise, if you have to leave, you have to leave. And if there's no questions, we could finish in a couple of minutes. But does anyone have any questions, particularly back in regards to what's required, what we are doing in terms of studying, and how many hours to put into the study as well? Any questions about the subject or about anything? Speak up now.
Do we have access to these documents that you've been screen sharing with us?
Possibly. So I'll see if I can find some access to the documents. Actually, sometimes one can put them on a location and then open up a file. So I'll look into that. And then the other way is that if you pause the video, you can also see what's there as well. Yep. Other questions?
Yeah, I have one. Just putting my hand up wasn't necessary. Could you briefly explain the difference between correspondence theory and coherence theory? Because they seem very similar to me.
Yeah, so correspondence is between the truth and what we use to describe that truth, which could be language, or it could be our belief, our perception of the truth. And then, did you say the other one was coherence?
Yeah.
So coherence is within the system. So if you're a particular Christian group, you would say that, so if you're a Baptist group that give baptism by full immersion, then you'd say the meaning of baptism is full immersion. Now, partly that coheres within your whole system of belief. But if you then go to the church next door, they'll have a different coherence theory. Let's say someone has a psychological problem, so they're a bit depressed or down. So if you go to one type of doctor, and they'll prescribe a tablet for it. But if you go to a counsellor, they don't, they're not part of that coherence group. And so they'll likely talk about various counselling. So we all have coherence within a frame of reference. So within our thinking area, framework, group, everything coheres. And so it's within that group that it makes sense. Whereas correspondence is saying that it's much larger than within the group. Correspondence is trying to come to grips with the absolute truth. And then pragmatism is saying that it works. It's William James said that we can't always locate the truth, but we can know what seems to work. And so in physics, is light a particle or a wave? One test shows it's a particle, one test shows it's a wave. In physics, you could join that particular coherence group, which believes in particles, or the coherence group that believes in waves, or you could try and combine two. So correspondence wrestles with the absolute truth, whereas coherence works within a particular group. Does that help explain that, Josiah? And then pragmatism is another way of going with it, as to whether it works. Yep. Other questions? So that all sounds good. So next week we go on to a Christian perspective on truth. And so that could include how we read the Bible, could include how we know certain things are true within our faith or within the Bible, and also could include both a more idealist idea. We believe in God even though we don't fully have all the evidence, as Alvin Plantinga says, or it can be quite empirical. God has given us the evidence. We can follow a natural theology like Apostle Paul says in Romans 1, look around you and see there is evidence. So we'll look at all of those ways of knowing truth. And between now and then in your forum post, you might want to reflect on what's your Christian perspective on truth, which you could also include in assignment 2. So look forward to catching up next week. Let me just pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together. We thank you that you're teaching us about truth. We pray that it might mean more than just passing knowledge. It might be a life-transforming relationship with the realities and opportunities that you've placed in our lives and before us, and in your Son, Jesus. Amen. So see you next time, and thank you each one.
Thank you.
Thank you. See ya.